Yeah.
So, thank you everyone for joining us for the last event of day one. It's been a real pleasure to start this week with so many great guests, great panels, great discussions, and of course, with great emotions on our side. I'm Marco Magnano, I'm the Director of Communications of the XR Safety Initiative. And yes, we worked a lot to get here. And so let's enjoy the last event for today. So we have with us Laura Brown, professional learning designer for XR. And Laura, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm very, very
Thank
happy
you.
to welcome you. And so have a great, great discussion.
Thank you very much for having me. I've learned about the XR Safety Week in the last few weeks here, and it really blended a couple of my main focuses professionally together. So I work in public safety, actually. I primarily work in training police officers for de escalation of mental health crises. So when folks are having a hard time at home, they'll often call the police for help, and I help train those folks who respond to those mental health situations. So I just wanted to frame the context of what I'm about to talk about a little bit because it is very specific. And I've also been doing some work in XR. I think, like most people here, I'm a bit of a nerd. I've been a gamer my whole life. I've been a front end content creator since the days of Angel Fire and X Pages back in the 90s, and working through mostly with 360 VR is what I'll be talking about today, but I'm also on several other projects that use fully immersive VR. So this is my first slide. If you can switch to the next one. So my experience as a learning designer and educator started when I was still in college. I went to the University of California in Santa Cruz and taught for a class called Writing Across the Arts, where we really focused on learning and honing skills of perspective-based storytelling. I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of the story Angels in America or seen the HBO miniseries. Seeing a heart, so that's great. Trying to get some feedback from the class here. It's a story that really revolves around multiple perspectives being taught simultaneously, from Roy Cohn of McCarthyism to a gay Mormon man to the wife of a Mormon man. Everybody's perspectives are sort of equally told, and it's quite an interesting one. So we read the screenplay, we taught the screenplay, we taught you're looking at the stage production version all the way here on the right, where we have the angel approaching our main character, and then you're seeing the HBO miniseries version in the middle, which is more of traditional film production. So when we're teaching writing across the arts, we're thinking about how do we how do we represent all of the factors that would go into storytelling in various mediums. So we did graphic novels, we did first person narratives, we did one man shows, we did film, and really thinking through all of the resources that we have to do that. So I just wanted to give that contextual background. I've been a classroom educator for about 10, 15 years. This is by far the most unique stage I've ever stood on. So thank you for designing this. And there's my cat, if you can hear her. We can go ahead and switch to the next one. All right. So just backing up a little bit and thinking about all of if we look at XR or immersive storytelling as if we were writing a play and we think through what our props and staging are, I just want to go through a non exhaustive list. I'm sure as I read through this, you'll think of things that you've used professionally or maybe you've thought about for a project. But all these factors go into play. So we've got our characters and whether or not they're going to be one that can be embodied by a player, whether they're non player characters, if they're bystanders, if they're animated and automated. You've got objects in the environment that can be interactive or not interactive. You've got the environment itself, this beautiful, you know, skyscraper like this is just a beautiful building that we're in, thinking through the environment, sort of what emotions you're looking to inspire in that environment, whether it's a finite environment or not. If it's like Mario, I can just run on and on and on forever. Whether it's a static environment, if it's evolving, like maybe we have the rain start falling through these windows here. Time and distance can be manipulated. If you've ever played Super Hot, time is dependent on your motion, your activity within the game. If it's paced, we're thinking about audio, whether or not it's stereo, field of vision and visuals. We can produce 2D that's embedded, like you're looking right now at my PowerPoint that's actually embedded inside of an immersive space. 180, 360, fully immersive. Folks use heads-up displays that they build inside of AR or VR. I can simulate visual limitations like blindness, tunnel vision, peripherals, myopia, etc. I'm using immersive animation. We see haptics, super exciting, cool haptics like gloves and full body suits, Tesla suits that we can implement into gameplay, and things like locomotion. So you're teleporting to get into this room today. Other apps will have you walking. You can use an omnidirectional treadmill. There's so many possibilities for you inside of this medium. I'll have you go ahead and flip to the next one, please. And with a first person simulation, we're starting to think about how this character that we're representing can be expressed within this immersive environment. Traditional games, and you've probably played many, characters often have a backstory, whether it's super simple or more pronounced. They have emotions, they have behaviors, all their mods can flip through all the behaviors and actions they can potentially portray. When we start to think about first person simulation or first person storytelling or perspective based narrative, we're also thinking about things like environmental stimuli. How does the weather affect this character? How do bystander behaviors affect this character? Are they socially anxious? Are they extroverted? Are they introverted? How are they going to behave when various things occur within the environment? What knowledge do they have? What have they been taught and trained? What intent may they hold in a different environment or context? So if I'm running, towards the edge, if I'm in a canoe towards the edge of a waterfall, what am I going to do? What beliefs do I hold? So if my character has a belief system, is it a faith-based belief system? Is it a culture-based belief system? Is it, as we'll get into with the next character I talk about from my work, how belief systems are changed by our surroundings? What are their emotions and activation levels? Are they excited, excitable, calm, sarcastic? What's going on emotionally? And then their sense of identity. So who does this character to themselves? And do they feel that they're being perceived in the same way that they think themselves? Thank you for flipping the slide for me. And I'm purposely leaving a good amount of time for Q&A, so I'm going to go through these slides and then I'd love to engage on what you folks have been working on or questions you have. But I'll just show a case study from my own work. Again, I've been working specifically in public safety for somewhere around, I'd say 7-8 years now. I've worked in training, specifically training teams that carry out various high risk process procedure and also those that are highly social work. So across public health and safety. So this is a project that I worked on for a company called Axon, where we were really trying to solve a complex problem. And the one that we were looking at was really this whole situation, if you've been following the news, in terms of how we're having folks respond to mental health crisis calls, whether it's a known crisis or not. If it's a known crisis, you could picture someone who is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, they're on medication for it. And for whatever reason, these folks may fall off of their medication regime. It may trigger a psychotic break that we would, especially if they need stabilization. Unfortunately, these are not conditions that we talk about freely or openly culturally. There's a lot of stigma wrapped around them. And also when we're growing up in our public school systems, we don't tend to talk about these conditions either, though there are lots and lots of families that are living with these conditions at home. So when we talk about law enforcement and social workers that are tasked, they're making decisions that impact the well-being of people. For this one, it was specifically those on the schizophrenia spectrum. And what we found is that depending on the cultural climate that you're living in, you're either making those decisions from a place of naivete. Sometimes, if you're a person with lived experience or you've got family members who live with these conditions, you have a really rich understanding. You've been immersed in it. Otherwise, you're coming from an outside perspective, one that could be naivete at best. And I've unfortunately seen it many instances.
Laura,
The immersive meeting was,
I think you got muted.
can't hear me.
I can hear you now.
Oh, I'm not on my side. Not on my side. You can? Okay. Hopefully that's not me. Oh, can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me? Great. Okay. So why we were focusing on using XR for this is because we were really representing a multisensory experience. So psychosis, which is the detachment from reality psychologically, it happens under extreme stress, duress. It can be chemically triggered, environmentally triggered, depending on, it could be substance triggered, um, across the spectrum of different behaviors. So we were focusing on how we can help educate others using this first person narrative. What you're seeing is a still from that. It was a 360 video. This hand that you're seeing up in the upper right hand is your hand. And you're actually in the first person perspective of a fictional character named Kyle. We didn't use an actual person with lived experience here because this is all still really new and we don't yet know the impact. I'd say like it'd be somewhat hazardous for us to put a person with lived experience in this position where they'd need to show us inside of their head, especially for someone with paranoid schizophrenia. That's not an experience most of them are looking to have. So we constructed this character, Kyle, by working together, and we can actually move to the next slide on that one. If you're looking to solve very complex problems like the one I just talked about, or perhaps even something a bit simpler, and you're looking to use first person narrative as a way to express that, maybe we're working on like an anti-bias class, an anti-racism class, we're working on historical or cultural perspectives. There's so many opportunities if you think about history education, current events, politics, lots of opportunities to use first person narrative. I would say that if you're doing it well, it takes a village, doesn't have to be a huge one. And to remember that Rome wasn't built in a day. This isn't something that you're going to probably knock out in an afternoon. But if you are looking to make this something that's streamlined and quick, I can offer you some questions to ask your person or your person with lived experience or that specific population to help make things a little bit easier. This is my last slide, so if you think of any questions, please just feel free to ask them at the end. So just a couple points to touch on here is the person with lived experience is either the author of the narrative, that's an ideal. Presenting their perspective through live action, you could picture somebody putting on a GoPro if we want to really know what it feels like to be a slalom skier. Strapping a GoPro or 360 camera on one of those individuals would be fantastic to get that feeling. Or they're heavily involved in the writing process. In my situation, we weren't able to have someone with paranoid schizophrenia sit down in a psychotic state and write the narrative, obviously. So working really closely with clinicians, behavioral analysts, families of those who have lived experience and those with lived experience themselves. Just to be as exhaustive as possible is usually a great way to start. Consider your budgets and resource constraints for your project. Talked already to a couple project managers that are in the room. I'm sure you guys think primarily about this. Make sure you have those identified early in the project. Your end user, so who's your audience? Sort of what conversation are you trying to facilitate and with whom should be identified really early on and preferably represented in the production process, just like you would for UX design. Content maintenance, think about how evergreen this content is that you're producing or whether or not it's going to be out of touch by the time you're done making it. It just depends on sort of what assets are you building, how, changing and evolving is the environment and the context or circumstances that you're talking about. Just keep all of that in mind. And if there's going to be any future hardware or software changes, I designed for the Oculus Go and it's already a dinosaur. So just good things to keep in mind. And I would say to build for the conversation you want to facilitate between your subject and their audience. So whose first person perspective and narrative are you telling and who are they talking to? Because that person's lived experience matters as well, right? Who's this audience? Who am I trying to develop reciprocity between? So in my case, it was between law enforcement and individuals with psychosis, and there's an overlap there. Obviously, there are officers who experience bipolar disorder and trauma as well. What makes their life experience unique, surprising, or confusing? That's really good material if you're trying to drive a narrative around perspective. To what extent are they self-aware and self-regulating? If we're working with folks who have special needs, may not be self-aware, they may not be self-regulating, and those are important things to convey when you're building out your narrative. How do they interact with the context and environment that they're being put in? So what stimuli are in the room? Sorry, can you go back one more? Oh, thank you. How do they interact with the context and environment they're being put in? Because you're going to be building that context in that environment in the immersive world. And which stimuli arouse specific moods, emotions, beliefs, and behaviors. So if we're working on a specific type of individual story, and what's most important is the way that they respond to something in their environment, we want to make sure we include it and also take into consideration sort of where the individual is at. We've built narratives on individuals on the autism spectrum, understanding what their interests are and who they're close to is important and that kind of thing. So just really taking the time to authentically understand somebody's experience so that you can best represent it in the immersive medium. All right. Go ahead and change slides. And that wraps it up for me. Again, I just wanted to keep this really tight so that there's an opportunity for discussion and we can all kind of learn from each other and what we're looking to learn from the day. But if you're interested in keeping in touch with me, I'm on LinkedIn. My name's Elaine Brown. I work in immersive education. I actually primarily work in training and education in the real world, but I do use immersive and multimedia quite a lot. I also work in policy and research for various public safety oriented causes. If you'd like to read more about Kyle, you can watch the full demo at this Vimeo link, and there's a couple articles out there, interviews just describing the nature of the work and why it's so important to learn about these populations. So that's it for me. Just a really quick one. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you for the emoji love. I think you can raise, if you want to raise your hand, there's a little hand raise emoji that's on your wheel. You go to your menu, there's a little smiley face guy, and that's your emoji pinwheel. Or you can just start talking if you want to ask a question.
I'll ask a question.
Please.
I'm curious, you said you've designed for like the Oculus Go and it's already a dinosaur. With how fast the technology is changing, is there any kind of emerging kind of new VR AR technology that you're excited about that you specifically think will be impactful for this type of experience creation?
Yeah, I mean, right now, the last couple years focusing on how much more cheaply and easy it's getting to create mocap driven content, I think is a really big one for the work that we're doing here, where we're representing conditions, because articulated movement, locomotion, all these behaviors that come out through mocap and facial capture, there's just so much more enriched than what we're seeing. We look awesome in here, but if I was trying to guess what everyone's inner worlds were like from just looking at their faces, that might be challenging. I wouldn't necessarily use these avatars for training, though they're great for this context. So yeah, mocap has been really great. That was awesome. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'll give you one. So on Friday, I'm actually hosting part of a data roundtable, and education is the group that I'm going to be helping out moderate. So I'd love to ask
Cool.
you your opinion. If you were to think of a scenario or a particular persona of a person that has to deal with this from a data privacy issue in education, whether it's student, teacher, or even an education firm that's trying to create this type of application, what do you think are the biggest privacy concerns or the biggest data issues that we need to be concerned about thinking about how to put together a proper framework for it?
That's a really good question, and one we come across a lot in law enforcement training, obviously, because if we're able to collect how officers are interfacing with certain subject types, it's obviously really interesting data to have in terms of recruitment and probation and training and all sorts of questions like that. I think it's one that has to be had really delicately. Actually, my background's in data analysis and policy research for education. And so working within school districts, that was also sensitive data. And we think a lot about FERPA and HIPAA because I'm representing not only education data here, but also potentially medical data, depending on, especially if I'm capturing anything like biofeedback from my student who's in the VR headset. Um, I think obviously practicing all of your data best practices in terms of encryption and ensuring who's owning the data is really important. And I would say that having a conversation where we have something that's akin to FERPA or HIPAA within the XR world is going to be really important. I don't know your thoughts on it, but with this highly sensitive data, I would personally be much more comforted knowing there is some sort of oversight. Having it kind of freewheeling feels a little bit unnerving to me right now.
I absolutely totally agree. And I think that's part of what the roundtable wants to get at is what is that next iteration of FERPA? What is
Yep.
the policy frameworks we can start thinking about that? I guess in terms too of XR specifically, are there just as a follow up, is there something that worries you more than something else, whether it's webcam data, if it's in mixed reality, if it's specifically VR, or if it's a biometrics or something else? Is there something that in the education setting that's going to be in your mind harder to deal with than say the general consumer population?
Yeah, I mean, especially when we're working within environments that are covered by FERPA. Like you can imagine being able to pick up where kids are, what they're doing, how, what they're doing when they're in the immersive realm, just I guess as a data analyst, I pick up a lot of insights from proxy data. So what data I don't see or, certain variables that are consistent patterns that I can start to do cluster analyses on. I really hope that the folks who are building these policies are aware of how data analysts work and that it's not always just the data that you're collecting that I can gain insights from. It's also helpful to understand, what students aren't logging into the immersive medium, which students aren't capable of, you know, getting through assignments in this new. There's just so in terms of like neurodiversity and supporting students of all types. We need to be really aware from the UX perspective of who succeeds in this environment and who doesn't succeed and why, and make sure that we have coverage in other mediums if we need to accommodate those students. Because I'd imagine there's folks who can't wear a headset for certain periods of time. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you. Just answering questions for folks coming down. I know your audio landscape is different depending on where you're sitting in the room, so feel free to come closer. Any other questions? We've talked about policy and application. For folks who've come in late, I'm a real world practitioner that uses XR to train law enforcement and first responders for de-escalation in mental health crises. Any questions pertaining? I'd love to learn about what some of you guys are working on too. If anyone wants to share. Yeah. Yellow shirt guy, and then I'll get to awesome leather jacket gal. Go for it. Yellow shirt. What's your name? Rick. Ricken.
Sorry, I'm late actually.
No, it's okay. Did you have a question?
Did you have a question?
No.
No, that's okay.
Okay. I think Divya, you had a question. What was your question, Divya?
I actually wanted to know whether or not you'd actually measured any real world outcomes actually with the
Yeah.
VR training you had done with officers, and I'd love to hear more
Sure.
about that.
Could you
Sure. I
repeat
mean,
the
so
question for the
yeah, happy to.
audience?
Happy to. So the question was, have we seen any real world outcomes? And that's a great question. So I want to say there's three main levels of where we would measure outcomes for this type of a training. The first one is on the student to student level. So whether or not I'm seeing any changes in the confidence in working with individuals on this spectrum, whether or not I'm seeing increased comfortability, whether or not I'm seeing behavioral change in terms of the way that we use in de-escalation, we talk about time, distance, and cover. So finding distance from people who make us feel uncomfortable, taking our time and speaking with them and making sure that we're not going to get hurt. That's the first thing. So we integrate these, we call them tactics for lack of a tactics as in strategy. We integrate these tactics into our work before we go out into the field. And we've run, when I was with this company, we ran, I'd say several thousand folks through it in its entirety while they're doing defensive tactics drills. So the first time you go through something like this, you're probably not going to see a behavior change, right? You're learning something new. You kind of got to process and meddle on it. So what we do is active repetition. This hasn't been formally studied by an institution. All of the outcomes that we saw from this program so far have been anecdotal, and mostly because we're at the awareness level right now. I'd say that we saw those outcomes. We definitely had individuals who got quite emotional when they went through this experience. Folks who have lived with folks on the spectrum in their lives felt validated and have reported things like feeling more comfortable talking about these issues within their classroom, which I considered a good first step. In terms of long-term so there's the individual, there's the academy or the class outcome, which is how does the class perform on a final exam. For these, we didn't do any exam. There's not really yet any what I would call reliable way to do performance evaluation for de-escalation for psychosis. It's such a new conversation, unfortunately, so that still needs to be developed. But anecdotally, we've put through classes through this. I've gotten some really intense feedback from some folks. You could imagine folks who are very there's a lot of stigma, right? So folks who are not very favorable of this population of people, a lot of criminals that are also experiencing schizophrenia. So I think there's just a lot of confusion and prejudice there. Working through those conversations, that was sort of at the academy level. And then in the field, I have not yet seen any longitudinal studies that have shown improved outcomes in terms of, ease of arrests or decrease of excessive use of force or anything like that, but I'd absolutely love to. That's the goal, ultimately, is having these programs be instituted. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I was just also wondering if you had been able to.
Oh no.
I'm actually not sure how you're measuring reactions in real time, but are you actually using any biometrics to collect data
No.
while they're in
So
the
this
VR? And is there any biometric data or biometrically inferred data that might be helping you assess the reactions?
Sure. So there's several projects that are sort of trying to accomplish this aim. I'm on a different one right now that's using a completely different tech stack. For that one, it was taught in person. So it was very easy to get reactions because we were actually running practical drills and then putting them through this immersive video in a otherwise tactical environment. So we're having all these conversations offline and in person. Where we're able to attend to emotional reactions. And I would recommend that if you're doing work like this that can be hyper emotional, you probably want to do it in a safe environment where there's somebody who's trauma informed on premise, just sort of another safety layer there. But for these other ones, we've not yet done police training where we just have somebody alone. They are definitely overseen by a professional instructor and someone who's been trained in crisis intervention training and who has the appropriate expertise in terms of managing these responses. That's probably something I should have said in the beginning, but they're very heavily moderated classes. So they're not just taught in VR. We're teaching it in an actual classroom. Did that answer your question? I hope.
Yes, no, thank you so much. And thanks for the work
Great.
you're doing.
Thank you. Anybody else? We've got plenty of time if there's questions. Go for it.
So my question is about it, it's kind of a nuanced conversation around how much VR, XR can build empathy and understanding, especially for people whose mental states might be different than one's own. And so I'm curious if you have, seen an increased understanding from the training that you're doing, or if you see potential for that, as well as what you see the limitations being around that.
Sure. That's a really interesting one. And I've seen articles that call VR like an empathy machine. And there seemed to be like this really intense wave of empathy hype maybe a year and a half ago. Empathy is a really interesting concept to talk about because it's something that's facilitated in our minds. And not everybody is capable of having empathy for everyone. That's not like a thing we're all born with. We all have conditions. Some folks are incapable of feeling or taking on certain perspectives, and that's okay too. There are folks who live in different states of mind or whatever that makes that not possible. The purpose of the empathy train that we built and taking it from that perspective is assuming that we're capable of developing a deeper understanding of someone through a perspective oriented approach. The understanding here is that the more we can achieve parity with reality, the more there could be potentially learning transfer into actual reality. And there's tons of studies I've seen, some good, some bad. I think they're starting to pick up in terms of the number of folks that are being studied as to whether or not that's true, what the contexts are, and who it is you're teaching. One of the things I've found in my experience is folks who are highly traumatized, folks who have been through a lot and have not had a chance to process some of the things they've seen in their careers. You can imagine folks who work in ICUs, folks who are first responders, social workers. It's a tough population to reach. Having that much trauma kind of on the day to day makes it really difficult to sit down and operate with a lot of executive functioning. And I think that's something that needs to be attended to. Is how much stress we're putting these populations of people through on the day to day and how that changes the way that they learn. If that makes sense. Is that
Yeah,
answer?
definitely.
Yeah,
Insightful quote.
totally. That's a great question. I think that's a really big conversation that we need to have is who are we training with this medium and how are they receptive to it? Great question. Any other questions? Anybody want to share anything that they're working on? I'm always
We
curious.
have one more question that's being typed up right now in the background.
Oh, cool.
If you give us just 1 second, I think that will come through. But anybody else have any questions? And I apologize about the typing noises, everyone.
Oh, it's totally fine. I'm seeing some folks coming in the back. Hi. Are you guys just coming in?
Welcome, everybody.
Yeah.
Welcome
If you have a
in.
question, you can kind of walk up towards the stage and ask.
Yeah, we're just doing a Q&A right now. If we want to, feel free to flip around the slides if you want. We're just talking about using perspective-based storytelling in XR. I work in public safety, so probably a more intense example than most folks would be looking for, but hopefully one that can be kind of grokked. Any questions? Any folks coming in have questions in general in terms of what they're looking to see or talk about today?
Okay, I've got a question that was sent in via text. Are you aware of police doing data capture and using it in spatial training or other applications?
Yes. Well, I don't know of any that's like a commercially out there program, but there's been conversations all over the place about using things like Matterport cameras for crime scene reconstruction. I'm sure if you YouTube around, you'll find some examples of it, but there's lots of conversations that have happened about how we could better use spatial computing to help with not just training, but also actually workplace productivity.
I know it's
Which is
silly,
really
but that makes
cool.
me think of like Minority Report or one of
Totally,
those
right?
movies, recreating the crime scenes. That's really interesting.
Which is a really good point to our data czar that was in here earlier. Sort of how do we keep that data safe? And how do we keep those analytics safe, especially if we're trying to do anything predictive, like what you just mentioned? I'm trying to read body language and it's amazing. Anything else? Anybody else have a question or anything? Anybody here working on a visual storytelling, anything like a perspective based or just even a third person narrative? Anybody doing storytelling in XR? Interested in it? Have an idea?
I guess I have a follow-up question since you bring in
Sure.
that point. It's more on the storytelling side of things, but do you see a potential for, with these type of experiences too, the branching narrative realms and how the different person's choices within situations then either inform a heroic journey or a tragedy, and how the learning can really happen through the choices they made, and they repeat experiences too, make different decisions, and choose different options in that space?
That was a great question. So yeah, so this Kyle piece that was written actually does flip into the perspective of the law enforcement officer and take you through a branch narrative sequence to explore how different force options would draw different responses from this individual, kind of help you understand how he'd behave. There are several awesome companies out there that are doing police training using a branch narrative framework. It's always a bit of a challenge because we're always going to have, it's hard. You can never predict what's going to happen on these calls, obviously. To the best that we're able to get them prepared for the highest risk, there are some fantastic trainers out there that are doing that. But yes, that's a great point. And traditionally, we've seen simulators like Vertra. Vertra is a company that makes law enforcement training simulators using video as well. So doing branch narrative through actual splicing together of film footage to keep that photorealism. And there's also other companies out there that are doing fully immersive traditional VR with branch narratives in there. Yeah, challenging build, but a very, very worthwhile one. Great questions. Anybody else? Good point. Also, I think we mentioned journalism earlier. This is a journalism themed day, and I don't know if anyone's brought up the 360 based journalistic pieces. Has anyone seen any of those from way back when you could like go to Syria and see 360 videos, or go to protests and see those? I would Google those as well if you're doing research on the topic in terms of how XR and 360 media is changing journalism. Being able to empathize with refugees, being able to empathize with individuals in foreign nations who are going through different political oppression. It's interesting. It's very emotionally impactful. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, I definitely recommend it. Ooh. Any other questions? Look at all the students that are lined up in the back. Interesting. All right. Anybody got a question? This is my first time in alt space. I wasn't sure if it would be easy to have class discussion or not. Cool. Well, if there's nothing else, I mean, I'm happy to wrap early. I know I'm the last person of the day, but if there's any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is laebrown@gmail.com, or hit me up on LinkedIn. It'd be awesome to connect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so
You're
much.
so welcome. Thank you, guys.
It's been a great,
That was terrific.
great way to
Really
complete
appreciate you coming out
a
and being the
very
last session of the
challenging
day. We
day.
know it's hard. Yep.
Hey, no problem.
Thank you to everybody else. It's been a terrific first day. I'm thoroughly amazed at just the participation, both in alt space and over YouTube. So thank you, everybody. We have 4 more days of wonderful events. So be sure to check out xrsafetyweek.org for the events calendar. And then you can also, on alt space, you can go in there and star different events for tomorrow. So we really look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. We'll leave the room open for a bit. So if anyone wants to stay around, if Laura's answer any questions privately, by all means, feel free to use the space. And don't forget, we have the outside gardens of the Taj Mahal. We have some NFTs and some other stuff out there for you as well if you want to use that space. So by all means, enjoy the time, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.